The room did not erupt when King Charles delivered the decision. It became frighteningly still. Camilla remained seated as the monarch calmly announced that, effective immediately, every private palace gathering involving the direct line of succession would proceed without her. No family suppers. No closed-door briefings. No intimate Windsor weekends. In a single measured statement, the king had separated his wife from the most guarded circle of royal life. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew everyone understood the damage hidden inside those words. He held a prepared statement from the restricted Buckingham Palace meeting, a gathering limited to family members because succession meant the order deciding who inherits the crown. The decree barred Camilla from conversations about family governance, confidential household decisions, and William's immediate family. She would keep her title, attend state banquets, national services, receptions, and official engagements. But the private doors were closing. Camilla tightened her hand around the chair. She did not protest. She did not plead. Instead, she looked directly at her husband and asked, "Does this include Christmas at Sandringham?" The king hesitated, and that pause wounded her before the answer arrived. The private portion, yes. Sandringham was not merely another royal residence. It was where the family gathered beyond ceremony, where belonging was measured not by rank, but by who remained after the public duties ended. William watched his father set the paper down. The prince showed no triumph, because he understood what the decision cost. Charles had chosen to divide his marriage in public, rather than allow a private conflict to follow the future king into his reign. That mattered, because every unresolved struggle around George, Charlotte, and Louis could become a struggle over the monarchy's next generation. The king's fingers trembled against the table. He had not acted in anger. He had signed away the comfort of having his wife beside him at Windsor weekends, Balmoral retreats, and family dinners, because every informal promise had failed. Camilla saw the truth in that shaking hand, yet the truth offered no comfort. Then she turned the page. The exclusion covered every private palace event already scheduled for the next 12 months. Her name had been removed from calendars at Buckingham Palace, Windsor, Sandringham, and Balmoral. One phrase appeared beneath the order. Following the breach at Windsor. Camilla read it twice. William remained silent. Charles would not meet her eyes. Camilla had heard the punishment, but before she could understand why her husband had imposed it, she would have to confront the people whose trust she had already lost. For decades, Charles and Camilla had survived scandal, public rejection, and the suffocating weight of royal judgment. Yet none of those battles prepared them for this. The threat no longer came from newspapers or crowds outside palace gates. It came from within the family itself. Charles now faced an impossible choice between protecting the woman beside him and preserving the trust of the son who would one day inherit everything. Camilla found him alone in a small sitting room after the announcement. She closed the door and asked whether he still trusted her. Charles looked down before answering. He trusted her intentions, he said, but no longer trusted the consequences of her involvement. The distinction cut deeper than accusation. She had endured years of hostility to stand beside him, and now the marriage he once defended was being wounded from within. William understood the private gatherings differently. To the prince, they were protected spaces where Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis could speak without fearing that a family concern might become an unofficial proposal. Succession meant the legal order determining who inherits the crown, but to him, it also meant protecting his children from pressures they were still too young to carry. That was why trust mattered. One repeated conversation could shape their futures before they had any voice. Catherine spoke to her husband later that evening. She told William she had wanted boundaries, not humiliation. The princess feared Charles would become isolated, and that a necessary correction might harden into permanent resentment. He listened, but he reminded her that 2 warnings had already been given. Camilla had been told not to share discussions involving the Wales children with members of her personal household. Anne refused to celebrate. She met William privately and told him that removing someone from a room was easier than repairing what happened inside it. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had supported the exclusion because private promises had failed. Yet she knew the decision carried a cost. Charles could preserve confidence with his heir and still lose warmth inside his marriage. Then the second warning surfaced. Charles had delivered it in writing after an earlier conversation about George's future schedule reached Camilla's advisors. She had acknowledged the letter, promised caution, and continued attending family gatherings. That made the latest breach impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding. A palace aide entered the records room and retrieved an old Windsor guest list. One name had been added in Camilla's handwriting without William's knowledge. The addition looked small, its meaning was not. The exclusion had exposed the family's divisions, but the true point of no return began weeks earlier, during a private Windsor gathering that was never supposed to leave the room. The decision did not begin in a council chamber. It began at a private dinner in Windsor, beneath the appearance of family calm. There were no cameras, no speeches, and no public agenda. Yet before the evening ended, a confidential conversation about Prince George's future had reached someone who was never meant to hear it. From that moment, every smile became suspect, every invitation became evidence, and trust inside the palace began to collapse. Charles had gathered Camilla, William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, and Sophie for a quiet family discussion. The purpose was simple but deeply sensitive, deciding how George would be introduced to royal responsibility without forcing a child to carry the full weight of the crown too soon. Royal responsibility meant the duties, expectations, and public service attached to life inside the monarchy. Everyone agreed the conversation would remain private. Phones stayed outside, aides were dismissed, and no written minutes were kept. William chose his words carefully during dinner. He described the proposed summer preparation schedule for Prince George and stressed that nothing should move forward without Catherine's approval. The next morning, Camilla's longtime advisor contacted the Lord Chamberlain's office and repeated that exact phrase. The Lord Chamberlain's office manages major ceremonial and household arrangements, so the inquiry immediately carried official weight. William confronted his father before noon. He demanded to know how a sentence spoken once behind closed doors had reached an outside office. Charles defended his wife at first, suggesting the advisor may have guessed. The prince then repeated the full sentence, including Catherine's approval, and the king's resistance faltered. Camilla finally admitted she had spoken to the advisor after returning to her apartments. She insisted she mentioned George's schedule only because it might affect her diary. Catherine heard the explanation and felt the wound beneath it. A private concern about her son had already been turned into household planning without her consent. Anne then produced another documented account from Camilla's office. It contained details from an earlier family discussion about Charlotte's future patronages, meaning the charities she might one day support publicly. William had never approved those details. Charles could no longer call the first breach accidental. The final blow came later. The king discovered a draft briefing describing Camilla as a continuing family counselor during the next reign. The wording transformed a private mistake into evidence that her household was quietly preparing influence beyond Charles's own reign. He summoned her without aides and placed the paper between them. The leaked sentence had broken William's confidence, but the document on Charles's desk would force the king to decide whether his wife had merely crossed a boundary or tried to erase it entirely. Charles did not raise his voice when Camilla entered the room. That made the confrontation more terrifying. He waited until the door closed, pushed the draft briefing across the table, and asked her to read the final paragraph aloud. The words described a future in which she would continue advising the royal family after William became king. For the first time, the monarch was not defending his wife from accusation. He was demanding an answer. Camilla read the paragraph once, then again. Charles explained that a royal consort, the spouse of a reigning monarch who supports the sovereign without inheriting the crown's authority, could not privately define a role inside the next reign. William alone would decide who advised him after succession. Yet the document presented her continued access as settled, turning a private hope into something dangerously close to an official plan. Camilla pushed the briefing back. She insisted it had never been approved and blamed over-enthusiastic advisors for presenting possibilities as decisions. Her intention, she said, had been continuity rather than control. After years of service, criticism, and public duty, she feared being discarded the moment Charles's reign ended. The king heard the fear, but he also heard the excuse hiding behind it. Charles asked why William had never been consulted. Camilla answered that the prince had already excluded her from conversations involving Catherine and the children. She believed his silence was a verdict, and she had tried to secure a place before that verdict became permanent. Her confession exposed the deeper wound. She had acted because she expected rejection, yet every secret step had made that rejection more certain. Then the room broke open. Charles looked directly at her and said, "You were planning a place in his reign before asking whether he wanted you in the room." Camilla removed her wedding ring, placed it beside the briefing, and asked whether he was speaking as her husband or as the king. Charles turned away. He stood in silence before answering that he was speaking as both, and that both felt betrayed for different reasons. The husband mourned what fear had done to their trust. The monarch feared what unchecked influence could do to the crown. Camilla finally admitted, in that recorded private conversation, that she had spoken with 2 senior courtiers and authorized them to examine which gatherings might continue after succession. Courtiers were senior palace officials who helped organize royal duties and household decisions. She denied ordering any formal change, but the planning had begun. Charles told her Anne, William, and the keeper of the privy purse, the official overseeing royal household finances, had recommended formal restrictions before the next family gathering. Camilla left the room without her ring, but the greater shock awaited her. The decision was no longer Charles's private burden alone, because the machinery of the palace had already begun moving against her. The order carried Charles's signature, but it was built by a quiet coalition that had lost confidence in informal promises. William demanded protection for his family. Anne demanded clarity. Catherine asked that humiliation be avoided. Even Edward, normally reluctant to enter domestic disputes, warned that another breach would damage the monarchy beyond repair. The king still held the authority, but the people closest to the crown had made inaction impossible. Anne placed a narrow proposal before Charles. Camilla would keep every public dignity attached to her position, yet she would lose automatic access to private gatherings about succession, royal children, confidential estates, and future household planning. Automatic access meant entry granted by status alone, without a personal invitation. The restriction was severe because it separated ceremonial rank from private trust, proving that a crown could open public doors, while family confidence kept others firmly closed. William supported the measure without satisfaction. The prince explained that verbal warnings had already failed, and another informal promise would only delay the next breach. He did not want to punish his father's wife. He wanted assurance that private concerns about Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis could never be turned into policy proposals through unofficial channels. Catherine sat across from Charles during the final review and noticed that he had not touched the tea beside him. She told the king she did not want Camilla erased or publicly shamed. She wanted her kept outside conversations where trust had already broken. That distinction mattered, because cruelty would deepen the family wound, while a clear boundary could still protect everyone involved. Charles admitted the order would divide his life between rooms. He would enter one as monarch, and leave another as a husband forced to explain why his wife was absent. Anne answered softly that leadership sometimes demanded loneliness, so the next generation did not inherit chaos. Then Edward produced a documented diary request from Camilla's advisors. They had sought access to George's summer retreat, Catherine's Sandringham gathering, and a Balmoral discussion about the next reign. Balmoral was the royal family's private Scottish estate, often used for secluded family meetings away from public ceremony. The requests proved that future access was already being pursued, not imagined, and that silence had quietly been mistaken for permission. Charles signed after midnight. He did not call an aide. He carried the order himself toward Camilla's apartments, knowing the ink would soon become daily reality for both of them before the night was over. The palace had finally drawn its boundary in ink, but the first true consequence would arrive not in a council meeting, rather, at a family table where Camilla's chair had already been removed. The first exclusion was not announced with trumpets or statements. It appeared as an empty space at a Sandringham dinner table. Camilla entered the corridor expecting to join the family, only to find her place card missing and the doors already guarded. Inside, Charles was seated beside William. Outside, his wife stood holding a folded invitation that covered only the public reception, not the private meal that followed. Camilla had already attended the earlier reception beside the king, greeting guests and carrying out every public duty expected of her. Yet once the official visitors departed, a courtier stepped forward and explained that the private dinner required a separate invitation. A courtier was a senior palace attendant trusted to manage royal arrangements and sensitive family instructions. That distinction mattered because public rank had protected her title, while private trust had decided whether she could remain. Camilla looked toward the closed doors and asked whether Charles knew she was waiting outside. The aide answered that the monarch had personally approved the seating plan. She lowered her eyes, folded the unused invitation into 4 careful sections, and allowed herself to be escorted away without protest. The silence hurt more than a public argument could have. Charles felt her absence immediately. He sat beside William, while Catherine watched him glance repeatedly toward the empty chair. Anne, Edward, Sophie, George, Charlotte, and Louis remained at the table, but the family gathering no longer felt like a victory. The prince avoided looking at the vacant place because he knew one visible sign of relief could turn a necessary boundary into cruelty. Camilla returned to her rooms and opened her household diary. Several private entries had vanished, including the Balmoral weekend she had expected to host beside her husband. A household diary was the confidential calendar used to coordinate personal royal engagements. Its altered pages proved the exclusion was not symbolic. Her daily connection to family decisions had been cut away. Then her senior advisor arrived with a resignation letter. In a documented confession, he admitted the Windsor disclosure had passed through his office, and that he helped draft the proposed continuing counselor role without formal approval. Camilla understood the full consequence. The palace had not only closed doors, it had dismantled the private network that once kept her near power. Near midnight, Charles left dinner early and entered her rooms. He found her beside a packed overnight case, waiting without advisors or heirs between them. The empty chair had made the punishment visible, but behind the closed door of Camilla's rooms, husband and wife would finally speak without the crown standing between every sentence. When Charles entered, Camilla did not accuse him of betrayal. She asked whether he wanted her to leave Sandringham before morning. The question stripped away titles, advisors, and carefully drafted language. For the first time since the crisis began, they were not king and queen consort debating authority. They were 2 aging people facing the possibility that the institution they had fought to survive might now force them to live separate emotional lives. Charles closed the door and told her to unpack the case. He did not want Camilla to leave the marriage, the residence, or the public role she held beside him. The exclusion concerned access and influence, not his personal commitment. Sandringham was the monarch's private country estate, used for family gatherings away from official ceremony, and being sent from it would have felt like a rejection deeper than any public statement. Camilla looked at the folded invitation and explained why the missing chair had broken her. Private royal gatherings had become proof that she finally belonged. Losing them revived every old humiliation, every whisper that she remained an outsider despite the crown she wore. Charles sat beside her and admitted that he had delayed setting boundaries because he feared she would mistake them for abandonment. His silence had created something worse. William's family had grown resentful, while her advisors treated hesitation as permission. Camilla then confessed that she had authorized the future role briefing because she feared becoming irrelevant after Charles's reign. She wanted proof that years of public sacrifice would not end with another locked door and another family deciding she no longer mattered. Charles answered with painful calm. Relevance, he told her, could not be secured by entering another sovereign's private life. A sovereign was the reigning king or queen who alone held the crown's authority. Her legacy had to come from the work she completed during his reign and the dignity with which she eventually stepped back. Camilla finally agreed to dissolve her private strategy office, end every plan connected to William's future household, and surrender any expectation of automatic access to succession discussions. She lifted her wedding ring from the table and placed it back on her finger. The gesture did not erase the wound. It accepted that affection and authority could no longer be confused. Charles promised to accept public responsibility for the exclusion, rather than let her carry the blame alone. By morning, the palace would issue a statement. Neither of them expected mercy outside. Their marriage had survived the night through painful honesty, but by morning, the private wound would become a public spectacle, and the nation would decide what it believed the exclusion truly meant. By sunrise, the palace gates were surrounded. The decision that had begun in whispered conversations now dominated every broadcast in Britain. Some saw a monarch protecting the future crown. Others saw a husband humiliating his wife before the world. Yet one image captured the entire crisis: Camilla leaving a public engagement alone, while Charles's car continued toward a private Windsor gathering without her. Buckingham Palace released a carefully written statement before breakfast. It confirmed that Charles had reorganized attendance at private royal gatherings to protect clear household boundaries and confidential family space. Buckingham Palace was not merely a residence, it was the central working headquarters of the monarchy, so every sentence issued from it carried national weight. The statement kept Camilla's ceremonial position intact, yet it did not deny her exclusion from discussions involving William, Catherine, their children, succession planning, or intimate family decisions. Crowds gathered beneath the gates as newspapers arrived. One front page carried 4 brutal words: "The Queen outside the door." Beneath them appeared the photograph of Camilla standing beside an empty car space after the king departed for Windsor. The image transformed an internal restriction into a public humiliation that millions could understand without reading a single official line. A broadcaster called it the most visible division between marriage and monarchy in the modern reign. People outside the palace argued over whether Charles had acted courageously or cruelly. Some praised him for protecting the future king. Others believed he had punished his wife before the nation after allowing her to stand beside him for years. Camilla watched the coverage alone until a commentator described her as defeated. She turned off the television. Sophie phoned minutes later and told the queen consort that accepting limits publicly might preserve more dignity than fighting them privately. The trusted confidant did not excuse the breach, but she refused to let shame become Camilla's only identity. William issued no statement. The prince understood that one triumphant sentence could turn a family boundary into open warfare between the king's wife and the future sovereign. Charles also ordered palace officials to remove wording that blamed her household alone. He accepted responsibility, confirming through the official statement that the exclusion was his decision and protecting family confidence was his duty. The silence protected Catherine and the children from further spectacle. That evening, Charles prepared for one final gathering without Camilla. How he spoke of her absence would decide whether the exclusion became rejection or a boundary the family could survive. The world had judged the photograph of Camilla outside the door, but inside Windsor, Charles was about to deliver the final verdict on what her absence, and his decision, would mean. The final meaning of the exclusion was revealed not through another punishment, but through a place left deliberately empty. At the next Windsor gathering, Charles looked at Camilla's unused chair and acknowledged the truth before his family. She remained his wife, his consort, and his chosen companion, but she would no longer hold a private position in the reign that belonged to William and Catherine. The distinction ended the struggle because everyone finally understood it. Charles faced William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, and Sophie without hiding behind prepared language. Camilla would continue her public duties with full dignity, stand beside him at state occasions, support her charities, and remain central to his personal life. A consort was the spouse of a reigning monarch who supported the crown without controlling its authority. Her title would remain. Her private influence would not. The king then confirmed that the exclusion from succession gatherings was permanent. Camilla might receive personal invitations to family occasions, but automatic access, advisory authority, and any future role inside William's household were over. That mattered, because the next reign could not begin under obligations created without the future sovereign's consent. William thanked his father, without celebrating. The prince said the boundary protected George, Charlotte, and Louis from inheriting old rivalries disguised as royal tradition. Catherine later sent Camilla a handwritten note saying distance did not have to become hostility. The princess offered courtesy without surrendering the privacy that had been broken. Camilla accepted the arrangement and resumed her public work without challenge. At a later reception, she spoke quietly to Sophie and admitted, "I mistook being included for being secure." The trusted confidant understood the confession. The queen consort had finally realized that belonging could not be proved by entering every room. Charles learned something equally painful. Love could not replace limits, and defending his wife did not require giving her access to every private part of the monarchy. By separating affection from authority, the king strengthened both his marriage and his position. The crown survived because Camilla was not destroyed, William was not overruled, and Catherine's family was not forced to accept another hidden arrangement. She retained her marriage, title, and purpose. He regained trust with his heir. The future king gained the protected space he had demanded. Camilla had been left outside the most private palace doors, but the final judgment was unmistakable. The monarchy endured because Charles chose a painful boundary over another generation of silent resentment. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.